Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. So I started reading this novel after being recommended it on some internet forums a couple of years ago, and it's always been kind of in the back of my mind. And I had expected it's something a little kind of Jane Austen-y, something in that sort of romance novel oeuvre, I guess you might say. Instead, I got something that's much darker and a lot more interesting. And I think as a whole, the novel can be broken down as a sort of struggle between like the natural world and natural human emotions versus constructed society and societal mores and civilization in general, and the sort of social structures we set up around ourselves in society. And more than that, I think a lot of the interesting things about the novel is that we get two like real framing characters. Mr. Lockwood, who's really knows nothing about the situation between the two manor houses and is just stumbling in and is almost unbiased in the way because he doesn't know what the hell's going on mostly. Like he literally just walks in off the street, sees all this weirdness going on and goes, I have no idea what the fuck's going on with this shit. Like, what is going on? Why are these people so weird? Why is everybody downcast? Why is everybody staring at this floor? What's with this weird kid who keeps swearing and like doesn't seem to know how to read? And what's with this like really haughty young lady who's raising her ire of the master all the time? And then Nellie, who I think wants us to think that she's, just a humble servant. She doesn't really know what's going on. She doesn't, she just wants to help out and stuff like that. But I think if you're really paying attention, like not only, first of all, she obviously lies multiple times and admits to it to Mr. Lockwood when she's telling her tales. So I think if she's lying and admitting to that when she's telling him about it, I think it's probably worth trying to figure out exactly what she's lying and not telling him about, or what exactly she's trying to smooth over in her telling of the tale to make herself a less active participant. Because for a lot of the novel, she is one of the most, if not the most active participant in the various schemes and going on between the manors, aside from Heathcliff. She is really a mover and a shaker in a way that she really does not want Mr. Lockwood to think that she is in a lot of ways. Even towards the end of the novel, when Mr. Lockwood returns to Wuthering Heights, she's the one giving Kathy a note and trying to write a note to Kathy to let her know exactly what's going on. Like, she's still in that mix trying to influence events, even though she's telling this tale like, oh, this is this thing that happened long ago, and oh, if only I'd known, I had no influence on any of these events. And then you got to kind of look at that and go, okay, well, what actually were you doing? Because you were very active and you were just as much of a participant in the various schemes between Edgar and Heathcliff as some of the other characters. But I think another thing that we need to look at, right, is if we want to understand what is going on in the novel, I think we need to look at it not from the perspective of Nellie telling the tale or Lockwood not really understanding what's going on. I think the main character of the novel, in a lot of ways, is Heathcliff, and I think it's important to look at what Heathcliff's life was like so we can understand exactly what was going through his mind and what caused him to make the moves that he did in the novel. Because when we start off the novel, right, Mr. Earnshaw Sr., Catherine's father and Hindley's father, goes to Liverpool and he brings back a young Heathcliff. And as far as we know, this child is an orphan. He was in an absolute set of deprivation. He had no money and he just probably had a very, very awful life. And then there is Mr. Earnshaw Sr., and he brings him back to the Wuthering Heights and tries to give him a good life, and he tries to give him an education and tries to raise him religiously and all that other stuff. And some of that takes and some of it doesn't. But the thing is, immediately we get the sort of clash between like the civilized and the natural, because Heathcliff, despite being just as much of a person, a human being, right, comes into this estate, and Catherine and Hindley are just aghast at it. They don't want to treat him as their social equal. despite what Mr. Eatonshaw Sr. is saying, because they see him as this like poor, uneducated, dirty orphan boy who their father has just deigned to bring into their lives. And that does, I think we shouldn't ignore the psychological damage that would do to a person like Heathcliff. You know, this is a person who some kindly stranger brought you into this nice warm home and is trying to provide you an education, and then his children are just treating you like garbage. And eventually Catherine warms up to him and they have this little budding friendship, budding romance, and they're exploring the moors. And, you know, she becomes, I mean, she says that she's Heathcliff at one point, but she becomes a lot more like understanding of his spirit. She becomes a lot more like him, like wanting to roam around, be free of this sort of social customs and stuff like that, because a lot of those social customs are already rejecting him. So why would he not reject them in turn? You know, he wants to be outside, he wants to be exploring, he wants to be in the natural world. And then Hindley is just, after Mr. Earnshaw dies, he's just absolutely awful to Heathcliff. You know, he threatens him and he makes him do backbreaking labor. So you have this character in Heathcliff who's been uplifted from like the deprivation of the streets of Liverpool, gone to this nice manor house, gotten an education, and then Hindley comes back and says, "Ha, no, you will be punished for being my father's favorite. I will punish you and bring you back to where your social class belongs." And he forces him into the fields and makes him work and says, "You will never be equal to me." But he can still rely on that friendship and love with Kathy to make up for that. You know, it doesn't matter how many times that they're forced to memorize sermons or be locked in their rooms, or how many times they have to escape and just hang out in the moors and explore weird fairy caves or whatever. Because at least he's got someone else in the world who cares about him. And then that ends up being betrayed when they both are walking along the moors and then stumble onto Thurcrush Grange. And you just, right away, again, you see the social element of the relationship just forces them apart, and in such a violent way. You know, the dog bites Catherine's leg, and then the Lintons take her in and they treat her like family and they feed her, and they're kind of mad that she was like sneaking around her property, but you know, she becomes like part of their life and their social circles in a way. And then you have Edgar courting her, and then at the same time Heathcliff is just treated like absolute garbage. You know, he's left out in the rain, they don't take him inside, they don't care about his well-being. I mean, this is still a child, basically, maybe a teenager at best. I'm not sure exactly how old he is. I don't know if anybody knows how old he is at this point. But, you know, they don't even care. His friend was just attacked by a dog, and they take her in, and then they tell him to fucking beat it just because he's not someone of status, someone of merit as far as they're concerned. You know, they care more about people's breeding and status than they do about the actual humanity of the event. And I mean, of course he's bitter and he's angry at these kind of people for that kind of thing. And I think a lot of people forget that towards the end of the novel when he's doing such awful things to other people. It's like, yeah, but other people have been constantly abusing him his whole life, so why would he not strike back? You know, it's like if you constantly try to kick a dog, eventually it's going to bite you. And you know, Heathcliff in a lot of ways is almost more of an animal than a human being, and a lot of that is because other people refuse to treat him as a human being. And then after that, when Edgar is courting Catherine, and then it's Hindley is just treating Heathcliff worse and worse. And when that little party comes at their house for Christmas, I think it was, and he's basically locked in a room while everybody else is allowed to dance and sing, and Catherine keeps trying to sneak up to his room, and Nellie is helping him, you know, get himself all prettied up or whatever, and then they just keep abusing him over and over again and saying, you know, you're not of anybody of worth, you're nothing, we only keep you around because you're good at doing farm labor, I guess. And then eventually, when it comes time for they have that fight, Catherine and Heathcliff do, because of the way that she's been acting, you know, at this point in the novel, she's sort of straddling the line between that Heathcliff and Edgar, that intellectual and that naturalistic lifestyle. And a lot of the reason that she seems to be leaning towards Edgar is because it's comfortable, and he can buy her things, they can live in nicer places and stuff like that. But like, she even says to Nellie, like, she doesn't love Edgar in the same that way that she loves Heathcliff. They don't have a lot in common, and she says she is Heathcliff because they share that same like inner world in a lot of ways. But because she's sort of been tempted into this land of social customs and social mores, she feels that she needs to marry Edgar. And then she kind of, personally, I think this is a delusion on her part, that she's going to marry Edgar, and then she's going to help uplift Heathcliff into a respectable sort of man. And first of all, like, personally, I find that extremely offensive. The idea, it's like, if there's a woman I love, and then she not only like dumps me, but then says, "Oh, I'm actually doing this for your own good, so that way I can help you because you're so far beneath me right now that if I marry this other person who's my equal socially, then I can help uplift you." And that's just deeply offensive in a lot of ways. And she says to Nellie that her soul will be degraded if she married Heathcliff. And I was thinking about that line a lot, because I'm not sure. I think it might just be that she's saying, Heathcliff is my social inferior, so if I marry him, I will be degraded like that, and we won't have money, and we won't have as much status or anything like that, and people will talk about me when I go to town, and it'll just be a bad time. But I think a more interesting way to interpret it, and the way that I kind of, in some way, I feel is more real, at least to me, is that she feels that she would be degraded by marrying Heathcliff because, in a way, Heathcliff has stayed true to his character, where she's been kind of taken in by all the money and the social standings and stuff like that, whereas Heathcliff has still remained the same person at heart, but he's just become more and more bitter. And so she feels that in some way she's already tainted, and then going back to Heathcliff, it would be sort of like bringing her and his souls down. I don't know if that's what Bronte intended, but I like it better because it makes her a little bit more self-aware. But regardless, I mean, her actions are just absolutely insane, and especially if she was going to reject Heathcliff in such a way, she probably should have actually had a conversation with him first. And let's not pretend that she didn't know that Heathcliff desired her, and he at least owes some explanation rather than hearing half of a conversation while sitting in a doorway after he's already suffered abuse at this party. And then when we get to the second part of the novel, all of her concerns, it seems, are basically completely false. No one needed to uplift Heathcliff, it's sort of like an evil version of it, but he is a self-made man. Nobody knows how he got his money, but the fact of the matter is he got the money. And then he proceeds through the second half of the novel to subvert the social customs of the era, to destroy both the families, and a lot of it, I think a lot of people could see it as like, oh, Heathcliff's this awful person, and he kind of is, especially in the second half of the novel, but he's leading people to their own doom. If it wasn't for the structures that civilization made, then he wouldn't have any power. Money is a product of civilization, and he acquires that. And then no one forced Hindley to become an alcoholic, but he did. And then he cheats him out of the Heights just by gambling, and his drunkenness. He can't win the card. So, Heathcliff is probably just cheating, and Hindley is too stupid to do anything about it, and he's too proud to just try to kill him, I guess, or maybe he's afraid of the law. and then when he forces his son, what's his name? Linton Jr.? I can't remember. Is that his name? Regardless, when he forces that kid to marry Kathy, you know, it's an evil thing to do, but is it really all that different from the kind of social marriages or marriages between two houses that are more intended to keep the wealth in the family or keep the properties in the families? You know what I mean? It's his character in the second half of the novel has stopped being this natural person and he's almost like a parody of what civilization is. He's the darkest aspects of all of it, you know? Instead of being like someone seeking the positive aspects of religion, he seeks like the negative, the ghosts and the hellfire, and he's this sort of tortured avenging angel. He swindles people out of property. He's always making money and no one knows how. And then towards the end of the book, he ends up corrupting the law with the corruptible lawyer that he pays to make sure that Thurcrosh Grange is put into his hands. And all of it is just, what he's doing is evil in a lot of ways, but he's only able to do it because of the artifice of civilization that all these other characters feel the need to abide by. You know what I mean? If these were characters who existed in such a natural state like Heathcliff did in the early thing, they could just walk up to him and fucking punch him in the face until they stopped attacking them. But they don't feel the need or ability to do that, and because of that, he ends up basically destroying both families for quite a bit of time. So I think one way to look at what Heathcliff was doing is to say he's not doing anything different from what the other families were doing or any of the other characters in the novel were doing. He was just doing it to the most extreme degree possible. You know, everybody else was trying to get the land, and everybody else wanted the proper marriages, and everybody else wanted more money and more fame and more social status and everything, but he was the one who was willing to just throw everything into the wind and just do it to the most absolutely extreme degree. If you look at Edgar keeps Kathy almost locked inside of Thurcrosh Grange for her entire childhood, basically, and then Heathcliff does the same thing to her, but we see Edgar as doing it as like, oh, he needs to keep her safe and blah blah blah, whereas we see with Heathcliff it's like, oh, this is just a vengeful man who's just tormented by the thing. But the actual physical manifestation of it is almost identical. Basically, Heathcliff managed to outplay every other civilized person at their own game, and in doing so ensured that he would die completely unhappy and completely alone, basically. You know, he doesn't really have a happy ending in life. You know, we can probably get to what happens in his afterlife afterwards, but you know, he doesn't have a very happy life. He doesn't seem like a very happy person, but he is a very successful person by every measure of civilization. You know, he married his son off to a person who got a very advantageous marriage. You know, he's extremely wealthy. He has multiple properties. He came from nothing and became something based entirely off his own merits and is willing to play this game. And he really ended up getting nothing for it, which is probably worth thinking about. But we got to move on to the next part, which I think, so we look at Catherine's character, right? And then she sort of exists in a state between the natural world of that Heathcliff kind of embodied at the beginning part of the novel, and then the like societal world that Edgar embodied. But then with their children, you see almost a distillation of that theme. So Kathy Linton, the daughter, she is almost entirely a social and intellectual person at the start. You know, she lived in a literal walled garden because her father wouldn't let her leave for the longest time, and like all she could do was read and socialize. You know, her whole world was so small because of that, but it was formed mostly entirely out of like personal connections and like that aspect of civilization, the intellectual one and social one, and then compare that to Hareton, who ends up being more than his actual son. It ends up being Heathcliff's son, basically. Hareton ends up being his foster son, and he is almost more Heathcliff than Heathcliff was, right? Because he never even got that like basic education that the senior Earnshaw provided Heathcliff at the very beginning of the novel. You know, he doesn't know how to read. He doesn't know really anything beyond what Joseph was teaching him about the Bible. But he's still happy, you know. He's out there plowing the fields every single day, and characters like Nellie will say, like, "Oh, what? This is such a degradation of a spirit and stuff like that." But he's a happy person, and it's not until Kathy Linton comes and makes fun of him that he really understands how ignorant of the world he is. But I think towards the end of the novel, when they finally get together, you know, and I mean, it's quite the struggle, and they, you know, she assumes that he's just a servant when she first stumbles onto the property. But they're still having a great time when she feels that she's superior to him, and then upon learning that they're theoretically at least in the same social standings, you know, she's like horrified and makes fun of him, and is just really cruel to him for much of the novel. And Nellie kind of tries to smooth over some of this because of her own love for him, but like Kathy, if you actually look at her character on the page, is a very haughty young woman who is constantly trying to flex her own intellectual superiority over Hareton and Xena and Joseph and everybody at the Heights. And it's really kind of gross. But at the end of the novel, when those two characters, you see them reading and stuff like that, that is sort of the synthesis between the natural and civilized worlds. I think that's what it's supposed to symbolize, right? Is those two coming together and they're in harmony. And then once Heathcliff kind of realizes that, you know, he realized that he could have had a better life with Catherine. You know, he realizes that things could have been different. He didn't need to be so revenge driven and revenge obsessed. And like he still seems very angry with Kathy, especially towards the end of the novel when they reveal that they're, you know, courting each other, I guess, as you would say. But at the same time, like it doesn't lack that passionate kind of hate, that like all-consuming hate that he had early on in the thing. It's just kind of like, oh, it's more like that hate, like, oh, this is something that I always wanted and then wasn't able to have. And it's been haunting him. I mean, literally haunting him, because Catherine's ghost is haunting his house, but like mentally also haunting him this whole time, where it's like, yeah, he's managed to tear down these two houses and then it's gotten him nothing and he's not happy about it. But this one event, these two characters coming together, it does serve as sort of like a redemption moment, but it's not really a redemption for him. It's a redemption for like the two families as a whole, that they can come together and still move past all the abuse of all the characters, of Heathcliff and of Catherine and their two children and Hindley and everybody and everything that's gone wrong in this. They're going to be into a better place after all this happens. And then Heathcliff finally ends up dying when he's haunted that. And then we get to the ending where the what was it, a little shepherd boy seems to see Heathcliff and Catherine Sr. walking along the moors like they would have as a child. And I like to think of it as kind of in the same terms of The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, where I don't think that their spirits really ascend to heaven or anything like that, or like an Empyrean afterlife, any sort of Elysium. But I do think they find like some measure of peace, you know, even if they're ghosts and they're just kind of remnants wandering around. I think that was probably the happiest time in either one of their lives, and they're probably going to just be happy together wandering the moors forever. I don't know if it's necessarily a depressing ending the way that I think some people might find it to be. Although you also do have, I believe Heathcliff's body was buried next to Catherine's, and then her body is still next to next to her husband. So some part of my brain wants to be like, oh, well, one part of her soul ascended to heaven and is with Edgar, and then the other part of her is still trapped on Earth with Heathcliff, but they're, they're making the best of it, I guess, is what you'd say. Although that kind of goes against what I would think in terms of, like, the metaphysics of the world, I guess. But, whatever, it's a book. But honestly, a really interesting read. Not a particularly long book. It's very interesting, a lot more dark and psychological than I would have assumed from a book of its era. And it's really interesting to me that someone who, as far as I can tell, is so sheltered as Emily Bronte managed to write a book that was so psychologically nuanced. Like, you'd expect it to be a little bit more, I don't know, like the characters to be more surface level or bigger in terms of just being caricatures, but they kind of don't. They feel very real. I also want to say, before I forget about it, Catherine from this novel kind of reminds me of Catherine from Jules and Jim. It's not a movie I particularly like, but I want to put that somewhere. I'm just not really sure where. I couldn't really work it into any of this review or anything, or this analysis, whatever you want to call it. But I kind of want to mention it because, I mean, I don't like the movie very much, but it's a good movie, and Truffaut's a good director, so maybe if you haven't seen it, just go check it out, It's a very complicated, another really complicated romance about a complicated set of people. That's probably enough trying to sell you on a director who probably doesn't need your help, seeing as he was extremely successful and also dead. Although, I do think Truffaut probably deserves more respect than he gets, especially lately. He's only got one movie on that new Sight and Sound poll, which is just ridiculous. He certainly deserves more respect than Godard did. Even if he's more experimental, I don't think he's half the director that Truffaut was. Although that's a very personal opinion of mine, and I don't think most people would think that at all. Anyways, one thing I think maybe I might have put too much emphasis on Heathcliff himself to the detriment of other characters like Catherine and Kathy, and to a lesser extent, Hareton. I think Heathcliff, in a lot of ways, reminds me, I wouldn't say reminds me of myself, but he has more similar circumstances to myself, being someone who was destitute as a child than any of the other more noble characters in it. So it sort of attracts my mindset. And being male, I think I have a natural tendency to gravitate towards thinking about his character in a way that I probably don't with the female characters. So I should probably reread it and try to dial in more on Catherine's character and Kathy's character, because there's something unknown to me, or unknowable to me, maybe. There's something elusive about Catherine, especially in her character, and some of that might be my own personal biases, but I also think it's kind of hard to tell, because we only get, from a purely unbiased standpoint, we only really get that small passage that Mr. Lockwood reads, and then her ghost trying to break into Wuthering Heights, and then the shepherd boys seeing them at the end. Because when we hear accounts about Kathy from Nellie, she's an extremely biased person. She's biased towards Catherine in certain points, and then she's biased against her in certain points, depending on how her own personal mood about Catherine is, and her own biases, even though she's trying to present herself as somewhat unbiased. And so then, since we don't really get a whole lot of what Catherine is actually thinking, I think it can be kind of hard to figure out what exactly is going through her mind. We don't get a whole lot of what she's actually thinking, aside from the "I am Heathcliff" speech and a few of her other speeches that she goes on to, little monologues. We don't get a complete portrait of the woman. And I feel the same is also true of Kathy. Nellie portrays her as this, like, almost angelic figure. She's super nice, and she's very understanding about Linton's situation. She only wants the best for everyone. And then when Lockwood runs into her, both times that he goes to Wuthering Heights, he finds her quite a bit less caring and less understanding of other people, and much more willing to use her social standing and her superiority over others and people like Xena, who've done her really no wrong. She's just a servant of the Wuthering Heights. There's no reason for her to treat her poorly, but apparently she does, just to lash out at other people. So I think it might be worth looking at her again, too. And then on a reread, I would also very much like to just sit there with a pencil and just actually take notes on exactly what Nellie and exactly what Lockwood are saying, and see if you can really figure out exactly how they're massaging the truth of what they're saying, especially Nellie. There's something, I don't know, there's something going on with her that I haven't quite put my finger on, but there's something there. She's not telling us the whole truth. But other than that, I thought it was a really wonderful story. I thought it was really psychologically interesting in a way that I didn't really expect going into it. And I mean, there's plenty of revenge tales. You know, one of my favorite novels is The Count of Monte Cristo, and that's a revenge tale. And that's this one's a little bit more psychological, where that one's a lot more like an adventure novel. I don't know. There's a lot of cool scenes and settings and places and characters doing things. This is really, I mean, it's a very it's a novel that's very secluded. There's only two houses. They basically never go to town. We never see any of the characters really go anywhere other than the moors, Thurcrush Grange, and Wuthering Heights. So I can't really think of many other novels that are that isolated, that are also these romantic, psychological sort of examinations of the natural world versus the societal world, or civilization versus nature, and how that affects human beings, but then using it or setting it as the frame device, being a sort of romantic novel. It's very different. I don't know if there's another novel quite like it. And I mean, honestly, hopefully I post this video and then people give me 12 other examples so I can read them. But, you know, maybe that doesn't happen. But yeah, I definitely recommend picking this up if you haven't. And